He was never meant to hear it. A soldier hardened by years of combat, a man carved by silence and scar tissue, taking leave in a place where the wind never slept. He walked alone through the choking gusts of a Mojave sandstorm, head down, mind drifting, boots sinking into sand that bit at his ankles. And then, through the belly of the desert, came a sound. A sound too thin to stand against the wind. Too fragile to be anything but desperate. He stopped. That faint cry didn't belong to the storm. It wasn't an echo from his past. It wasn't an enemy creeping through the dark, nor the voice of someone long gone. What he found instead was a German shepherd mother chained to a wooden stake hammered deep into the sand. Her 2 pups were pressed against her ribs, barely breathing, too weak even to whimper. She should have been dead. All 3 of them should have been. But somehow, in that suffocating desert storm, they hung on, waiting for someone. Waiting for him. What happened next became a story of mercy, of redemption, and of a mother's stubborn love that refused to surrender to the wind. Before we get started, the narrator's voice might say, "Where are you watching from?" Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you believe no soul deserves to be abandoned, hit subscribe and type Amen. The Mojave never whispered. It screamed. On nights like that one, when the wind swept down from the dark hills in thick sheets of sand, the desert took on a voice, sharp, restless, almost alive. On the outskirts of Barstow, California, near a decommissioned army checkpoint barely visible on modern maps, the storm slammed across the plains like a freight train made of dust. Even the stars had vanished behind a curtain of brown and gold. A row of aging temporary military housing units sat hunched against the wind. Rust clung to their sides more faithfully than paint ever had. Most soldiers stayed inside, killing time with card games, instant coffee that tasted like metal, or pretending to sleep through the noise outside. But not Staff Sergeant Reuben Walsh. Reuben stood beneath a corrugated metal awning behind the supply depot, arms folded, jaw clenched, letting the storm whip sand against his face. Grit stung the narrow scar along his left cheek, a reminder of a mortar blast in Raqqa. At 41, he had the frame of a man built more by years of tension than by muscle. Tall, lean, worn. His dark blonde hair was clipped short, but not regulation short anymore. He was technically on medical leave. His green eyes, once sharp and commanding, now carried a distant, hollow quiet. He didn't talk much these days. The unit called him Sarge, but the younger soldiers had another name for him. Ghost Listener. Not out of mockery, but because Reuben had a way of hearing things no one else did, sounds buried in silence, whispers tucked in wind. Some blamed trauma. Some called it instinct. Others said the desert spoke to him differently. He had been at this rotation site for 2 weeks, assigned to a low-profile recovery group for soldiers working through adjustment issues. No combat drills. No missions. Just wind, dust, and too much time. But for a man like Reuben, silence wasn't rest. Silence was memory. And memory was loud. He stared into the storm. The lone floodlight above the back door buzzed and flickered, casting a pale cone of light that barely reached the dunes. Beyond that, there was only moving sand. And then he heard it again. Not wind. Not metal. Something else. A sound wrapped in exhaustion, thin, broken, fading. He leaned forward. "Sir." Reuben turned. Private Miles Ortega, barely 20, stood behind him holding a flashlight and a clipboard that trembled in his hands. Baby-faced, stocky, with arms that looked strong but eyes that looked uncertain, always wondering if he belonged wherever he happened to be. "You all right, Ortega?" Reuben asked. Miles nodded quickly, eyes flicking toward the storm. "Just finishing rounds, sir. Saw you out here." Reuben didn't answer immediately. He tilted his head back toward the desert. "You hear that?" Miles listened. "Just the wind, sir." "No." Reuben stepped off the awning, boots sinking into loose sand. There's something else. Ortega hesitated. Sir, we're not supposed to leave the perimeter. I know the rules, Reuben said sharply. Grab another flashlight. They moved past the edge of the compound, boots crunching over half-buried brush. The wind roared louder as they passed the skeletal remains of an old watchtower, now home mostly to owls and ghosts of rotations past. A section of chain-link fence had collapsed inward, twisted like something wounded. Reuben stopped suddenly. He knelt, raising a hand for silence. Ortega froze. There it was again, a whimper. Faint, reedy, strangled by the wind, but unmistakably real. Here, Reuben murmured. His flashlight sliced through the swirling dust, catching nothing at first. Then something moved. 10 feet away, at the base of a bent mesquite tree, lay a shape so dust-covered it blended into the ground. A dog. No, 3 dogs. The mother, a full-grown German shepherd, lay on her side. Her ribs jutted sharply beneath fur dulled by sand and sores. Thick rope bound her legs, tethering her to the tree. Her ears twitched weakly. Her pups, maybe 2 months old, were curled against her belly, fur matted, eyes crusted, breaths shallow. Holy, Ortega breathed out. Reuben fell to his knees. They've been here a while. Look, her paws are worn to the bone. He extended his hand slowly, letting the mother catch his scent. Her eyes opened a sliver, dark, exhausted. No growl. She didn't have the strength. One pup whimpered and burrowed closer to her warmth. She's letting us near, Reuben whispered. Means she wants help. Ortega crouched beside him, face pale. Who would do this? Reuben didn't answer. His mind flashed back to Syria, to rubble, screaming metal, and a dog trapped under broken concrete. A dog they dug for until their hands bled. A dog who still tried to bark even as his lungs failed. A dog who saved 5 lives before his own ended. This mother, this soldier in fur, deserved more than this desert grave. Cut the ropes, Reuben ordered. Ortega fumbled out a pocketknife and got to work. We need blankets, Reuben said. Water. Gloves. Yes, sir. While Ortega sprinted back, Reuben stayed kneeling in the sand. He shrugged off his jacket and draped it over the trembling dog. Her eyes tracked his movements. When he touched her side, she released a low, exhausted sigh, not fear, not protest. Surrender. You're safe now, he whispered. Behind them, the storm raged on. But Reuben no longer heard it. He heard only the fragile breaths of 3 lives holding on by a thread. The desert wasn't whispering anymore. It was crying. And for the first time in a long time, someone listened. The wind began to settle, but traces of the storm still clung to everything it touched. Fine dust coated every surface, filling the seams of clothing and skin, turning breath into scratchy coughs. Reuben Walsh walked ahead with steady, careful steps, Private Miles Ortega right behind him. Each footfall crunched against wind-hardened sand. In Reuben's arms lay the German shepherd mother, her body limp but warm, heavier than she looked, all bone beneath her fur. One of the pups, a black-coated little male, had tucked himself inside Reuben's jacket, curling instinctively against his ribs. The smaller tan-faced pup rode in Ortega's arms, wobbling with each shift of his stride. We're gonna get our asses chewed for this, Ortega muttered, not rebellious, just resigned, sweat streaking down his face. You know that, right? Reuben didn't respond. His eyes stayed fixed on the faint lights of the supply compound a quarter mile away, flickering like distant candles. Every few steps he glanced down at the mother dog. Her eyes remained shut, her breathing thin but steady. She's still hanging on, he whispered. Ortega swallowed. I used to have a dog, he said after a moment, voice softer. Back home. Named her Nala. Half husky, half, something fluffy, I guess. She'd cry at the door every time I left for school. He paused. I cried harder when she died than when my grandma did. Reuben's gaze softened, just for a heartbeat. Soldiers carried a lot of grief that never made it into their reports. You name them yet? Ortega asked, nodding toward the pups. Not yet. Ortega looked at the tan one in his arms. I'd call her Scout. Looks like she's always searching for something. Reuben gave a small grunt. Approval. Then this one can be Dusty, he added, glancing down at the black-furred pup tucked against him. Because of the sand? Ortega asked. Because this desert didn't beat him. By the time they reached the back entrance of the compound, the storm had weakened into nothing more than a tired sigh. More ghost than wind. Reuben nudged the door with his boot. Ortega slipped ahead and eased it open. The storage area inside glowed with the weak light of a single hanging bulb swaying gently in the draft. Stacked crates, old canvas rolls, and surplus tarps lined the far wall. The room smelled faintly of mildew and gun oil, an odd combination, but familiar. Here, Reuben said quietly. He set the mother dog, Sarah, he decided for now, onto an old padded mat they dragged out days earlier. He removed his jacket and gently placed the sleeping Dusty beside her. Ortega knelt and laid Scout next to her brother. The dogs huddled instinctively toward their mother's warmth. Can't believe someone tied her up out there, Ortega murmured. Just left her to die. People abandon worse in worse places, Reuben said, voice flat with memory. The mother stirred at the warmth of the room, lifting one eye a fraction. Her tail twitched, almost a wag. Reuben felt something in his chest tighten unexpectedly. Footsteps echoed outside. Ortega stiffened. You think that's the LT? But it wasn't Lieutenant Voss. The door swung open and in stepped Kellen Doc Ashford, the camp medic and unofficial moral backbone of the place. In his mid-60s, lean and wiry, Doc moved like a man carved by years but too stubborn to bend. His narrow face carried permanent creases from squinting under harsh lights, and a trimmed gray beard framed his jaw. He wore a faded green hoodie and cargo pants, a med kit hanging from his shoulder. He froze in the doorway. What in God's lonely desert are you two doing? He demanded. Found them outside, Reuben replied calmly. 3 total. Mother was tied. Doc sighed, the long, heavy kind reserved for nonsense he'd seen too often. Still, he stepped closer, kneeling beside the dogs. His hands, though aged, moved with practiced precision as he checked limbs, paw pads, ribs. She's dehydrated, he said. Starving. But no broken bones. He examined the pups. These two, barely hanging on. You gonna report it? Ortega asked carefully. Doc raised an eyebrow. You. Reuben shook his head. Then neither am I. He pulled a small bottle from his bag. Pedialyte, he said. Baby syringe too. Good enough to keep things moving, if you go slow. He handed them to Reuben. Hold Scout's head steady. For the next 20 minutes, the 3 men worked with quiet urgency. Reuben fed Scout drop by drop, focusing on her tiny gulps. Ortega gently cleaned Dusty's ears with fresh gauze, whispering encouragement under his breath. Doc wrapped the mother in a thermal blanket and propped towels beneath her flanks to ease pressure. They need real food, Doc said at last. And a vet. The closest town is 20 miles, Reuben replied. There's someone in Yermo, Doc said. Retired vet. Ginny Poe. Runs a thrift shop/clinic out of her garage. Treats strays. Doesn't ask questions if you bring muffins. Reuben nodded, storing the name away. Doc stood. Move them soon. LT's bound to come through here, and he's allergic to exceptions. Understood. Doc paused at the doorway. Then, quietly. You know, Back in Iraq we had a mutt wander into camp every night. We fed him scraps. One night we didn't. He still showed up. Doc smirked dryly. Brought us a boot. Didn't belong to any of us. He tapped the doorframe. Sometimes it's the dogs who find us, he said before walking out. Reuben looked down at Sarah, still curled, still breathing, still fighting. You're staying with me tonight, he whispered. The storage shed behind the motor pool wasn't much. 4 walls, a half-working roof, and a kind of privacy you only found in forgotten corners of a military base. But for now, it was home. He brought in 2 old cots, one for him, one layered with blankets, towels, and a patched-up parka stuffed with clean rags. That one became the dog's bed. His cot stayed unmade in a corner like an afterthought. Sarah curled protectively around the pups in a crescent of fur and breath. She wasn't eating yet, but she licked the pups more now. Earlier, when Reuben changed Scout's bandaged paw, Sarah had only lifted her head, not to growl, but to watch. Trust, not freely given, but allowed. Outside, the Mojave returned to its typical quiet, cold, open, and unapologetic. Inside, the rhythm of 3 fragile lives breathing in unison became a sound Reuben didn't realize he'd missed. The door creaked open again. Doc stepped in with a canvas bag and a styrofoam cooler. Got your contraband, he said with a wink. Tuna, rice, boiled eggs, Pedialyte. And a hot pack if she's still shivering. Reuben nodded. Thanks. Doc sat on a crate, knees popping. She walking yet? Stood for a few seconds this morning, Reuben said. Back legs stiff. Paw pads raw. Doc nodded. Keep flushing with saline. If she refuses water or heats up, we'll need antibiotics. Got it. Doc glanced at the pups. You name them. Dusty and Scout. Doc smiled, soft, rare. Good names. He hesitated. Then said quietly. You know, my boy Ethan used to leave food out for strays everywhere we went. Said dogs remembered kindness longer than people. Reuben listened, still. He was 10 when we deployed to Kandahar. By 16, he said he wanted to serve. Doc's voice tightened. I told him to wait. Told him to live first. He enlisted anyway. A long breath. He came home in a flag. Silence settled over the room, not heavy, but sacred. Doc eventually stood. I'll check in tomorrow morning. After he left, Reuben warmed the rice near the makeshift heater, a lantern gutted and rebuilt. He mashed the egg, mixed it with tuna, and offered the bowl to Sarah. She sniffed, looked at him, then leaned forward and ate, slow but deliberate. Good girl, he murmured. That night he didn't sleep. Couldn't. He watched Scout's tiny chest rise and fall. Watched Dusty twitch in quiet dreams. Watched Sarah blink every now and then to make sure her pups were still there. Near dawn, Reuben opened his notebook, and used Sinceria, and wrote. Water. Towels. Antibiotics. Contact Ginny Poe. Ask Doc about heating pad. Keep them safe. He underlined the last line twice. Morning in the Mojave did not arrive gently. It came sharp, slicing across the desert in sheets of white heat that exposed every cracked surface and silent scar. Sunlight crept beneath the warped edges of the storage shed, turning the cold concrete floor pale and harsh. Inside, the day began in soft movements. Scout stretched against her mother's belly. Dusty yawned wide enough for his ears to twitch. Sarah, still battered, but no longer lifeless, blinked at the morning light as though daring it to try her. Reuben Walsh had been awake for hours. He hadn't moved from the floor. One boot rested over the other, back against the wall, his notebook still open across his lap. At some point he dozed off sitting up, and Scout had stepped across him in the dark, leaving a tiny paw print smudged on the paper. A faint ring of spilled coffee framed part of his list. He stirred when a small metallic sound clicked against the crate beside Sarah. She had nudged something while shifting her paw. Reuben pushed himself up, knees aching, and knelt beside her. At first he thought it was a simple collar charm, something cheap, the kind handed out with adoption packets. But when he lifted it, he realized it was old. A tarnished oval dog tag, dull with grime, dangling from a faded pink cord frayed nearly to threads. He rubbed the metal with his thumb, brushing away grit until letters surfaced. Loretta. Not a mistake. The words hit him harder than expected. Someone had engraved those letters by hand. Someone had meant them, meant every stroke, every curve. It wasn't just a name. It was a statement. A promise. A protest. Reuben sat back, turning the tag over in his palms. He looked at the shepherd, Sarah no longer, but Loretta, who watched him with tired, steady eyes. "You're not a stray," he said quietly. "Someone cared about you. Someone fought for you." He reached for the bandages wrapped loosely around her neck. His hands were careful, slow, practiced, peeling away the layers one by one until the raw skin beneath was exposed. The wound from the rope was healing, but it wasn't the injury that stopped him, it was the mark underneath. A deep, permanent collar scar. She hadn't been tied up for the first time. She'd been owned long enough to be shaped by it. Later, while Doc Ashford was out restocking saline and antiseptic, Private Miles Ortega burst through the rear entrance of the compound. His boots skidded on the concrete, and he clutched something in both hands like a relic pulled from the earth. "You're not gonna believe this," he panted, sweat streaking down his neck. Reuben raised an eyebrow. "I went back out to the fence line," Miles explained, still breathless. "Thought I'd retrace where we found them. Maybe whoever left them behind dropped something." He held out a battered, water-warped composition notebook, the cheap kind sold for $1. The cardboard cover had peeled almost in half, and the pages curled like dried leaves. But inside, the drawings were still there. Reuben opened the notebook gently. Pages filled with pencil sketches, childlike, wobbly, but purposeful. A mother dog curled around two small pups under what looked like a playground slide. Another page showed the three dogs together, tiny hearts drawn above them. Another showed a house, but the dogs were outside, behind a fence, watching the door. Then came a page with words written in blocky, uneven handwriting. "Don't worry, Mama. I'll be okay. I miss you." Reuben didn't speak. He closed the notebook. Then reopened it, slowly, looking for names, addresses, anything that might lead to whoever had written it. "Found it under a half-buried tarp," Miles said. "Might have blown off a truck. Or someone dumped it." Reuben shook his head. "She didn't write this," he murmured, glancing at Loretta. "But someone who loved her did." A silence settled between them, heavy, but meaningful. Later that afternoon, Reuben sat at the shed's only desk, an old folding table with peeling paint, his government-issued laptop balanced atop a crate of unused rations. The base's internet was slow and barely meant for personal searches, but it was enough. He checked animal shelters. Lost dog bulletins. Rescue groups. Nothing. Then he dug deeper, public county pet registries, mobile microchip clinic logs, vaccination records. One entry stood out. Loretta, German Shepherd, female, approximate 5 years old. Vaccinated 14 months ago. Owner, J. Dawson. Miles leaned over his shoulder. Dawson. That's something. Reuben clicked open the archived form. The listed address sat in one of Barstow's outer neighborhoods, not rural, but forgotten. A place where people lived because they had nowhere better to go. He scribbled it down in his notebook. "We're going to figure out who did this," he muttered, glancing toward the cot where Loretta and the pups slept. Scout had sprawled across Dusty, licking his ear in her sleep, while Loretta rested one paw protectively across their bodies. It was a quiet vow, but fierce. The kind of promise men like Reuben didn't make lightly. Just after 0700, a sharp knock landed on the shed's metal wall. Firm. Commanding. No hesitation. Staff Sergeant Walsh, a voice barked. Open up. Reuben set the bowl of food aside and rose slowly. Loretta lifted her head. Scout stirred. Dusty groaned and nuzzled deeper into her fur. Reuben opened the door. Standing there in crisp fatigues, cap tucked under one arm, was First Lieutenant Cameron Voss, mid-30s, sharp-jawed, hair cut close enough to show the scalp beneath. He carried the rigid posture of a man who took regulations as gospel. Known across the base for being exact, narrow in patience, and painfully by the book. His eyes swept the room. They landed on the dogs. You've got to be kidding me, he said. They're not a threat, Reuben replied calmly. And we're keeping the area contained. This is not a kennel, Staff Sergeant, Voss snapped. You know damned well this is unauthorized. Bringing animals into a federal compound? Concealing them? Pulling personnel into it? Sir, came a voice behind him. Ortega arrived breathless, holding a printed page. I compiled a report. You should see this. Voss snatched it, annoyed, but curious. The paper contained a photo of the dog tag engraved with Loretta, not a mistake, followed by a short summary of the veterinary record and a scanned page from the notebook Miles found. The final section outlined suspected abandonment. Circumstantial at best, Voss muttered. That may be, came a new voice. Doc Ashford stepped inside, calm, but furious in the way quiet men are when something sacred is being threatened. Voss turned. You're not in command here, Sergeant Major. Retired, Doc corrected. But I've served longer than your paperwork's existed. And I've seen what dogs like her can do. They're more than strays. Reuben gestured toward Loretta. Look at her neck. You think that rope wound is a coincidence? You think she dragged herself half a mile for fun? Voss opened his mouth. But another knock came. Softer. Am I interrupting? Specialist Harlow Quinn stood in the doorway. Auburn hair braided tight, sleeves rolled down to hide tattoos, posture steady. Known for speaking only when needed, and usually for the defenseless. She held out a signed statement. From an older woman, Clara Mendez. A neighbor of the Dawsons. They left her outside all night, the letter read. Never barked. Just waited. Then one day, they stopped coming back. Reuben handed it to Voss. The lieutenant's jaw ticked. We want a review, Doc said. A formal hearing. Not to adopt, Reuben added. Just to keep her safe until we know the truth. Voss looked at the pups. At Loretta. At the men standing between him and regulation. A long, reluctant pause. Then. You'll get your hearing, he said. 1,500 hours. Briefing room B. He left. 3 hours later, the briefing room pulsed with a quiet, simmering tension. It wasn't a courtroom, but it felt like one. Folded metal chairs lined the walls. A projector hummed in the corner. Soldiers filtered in slowly, some curious, some skeptical, others simply following orders. A JAG officer sat near the front, a calm woman named Captain Rena Park, brought in to oversee the informal proceeding. She wore her professionalism like armor, steady, sharp-eyed, unshaken. Loretta and the pups waited in the adjacent supply room under the care of Harlow and Ortega. Reuben, Doc, and a handful of command staff took their seats at the front. Doc didn't stand in uniform, he didn't need to. His presence alone carried more weight than half the medals on the wall. He stepped forward first. I once watched a canine take shrapnel meant for a man who never bothered learning the dog's name, Doc began. The man forgot. The dog didn't. They always remember who we are. He spoke plainly, without theatrics. Stories from years past, dogs that shielded medics, led civilians through burning streets, calmed soldiers on nights when panic threatened to swallow them whole. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't need to. He simply told the truth. When Doc stepped back, Reuben moved forward. He connected a flash drive to the projector and handed the remote to Captain Park. The screen flickered to life. Grainy green night footage filled the wall. The image of Loretta, skinny, trembling, body curved protectively over her pups, appeared beneath the wreckage of a broken panel as the sandstorm tore at her. Her head lifted once toward the camera, eyes dull but unwavering. A soldier's voice whispered from the speakers. "She's shielding them." The next clip, filmed inside the shed during daylight, showed Scout pawing at Dusty's bandaged leg. Loretta licked both pups as they whimpered softly. The room watching the footage fell silent. "She never barked," Reuben said quietly. "Not once. Not from fear. Not from pain. She protected them anyway." Captain Park nodded gently. "Thank you, Sergeant." Next was Miles Ortega. Nervous, palms damp, tie crooked, but voice steady. "I've been helping care for the pups," Miles said. "I saw Dusty drag himself across the floor just to curl into his mom. Even when his leg was hurting bad." His voice cracked slightly. "Animals don't do that when they're neglected. They do that when they love. When they're trying to survive." When Miles sat down, the room shifted, just a little. Even hardened soldiers had softened expressions. Then Tracy Miller stood. "Your Honor," she began, smoothing her blazer's sleeve, "I would like to speak." The judge, no judge, but Captain Park, gave a single nod. Tracy stepped into the center of the room. She was polished, composed, and armed with the kind of confidence used by people accustomed to being believed. "I did not abandon those dogs," she said firmly. "I left them somewhere safe. With shade. With food. We had family challenges. My stepdaughter is allergic. The dogs were dirty. I plan to go back." Captain Park raised an eyebrow. "You tethered them in a field during wind season. I didn't know it would storm." As those words echoed through the room, something unexpected happened. From the adjacent supply room came a sharp, single bark. "Scout." The bark rang through the briefing hall like a small, furious declaration. Everyone turned. Even Voss flinched. A few quiet laughs released the tension, but Reuben felt pride swell in his chest. Captain Park folded her hands. "I've reviewed the veterinary notes, the witness statement, and all evidence provided," she said. "The behavior of the animals, the injuries, and the testimony paint a consistent picture." She paused. Loretta and her pups were abandoned. And they were endangered. She straightened her papers. "I am granting temporary custody to Staff Sergeant Walsh. And authorizing the U.S. Army to retain the dogs on base until a final ruling is made." Tracy's mouth fell open. Her husband, Martin, leaned closer and whispered, "Let it go." But she didn't. "This is ridiculous. They're just dogs." Captain Park's gaze sharpened. "No," she said firmly. "They're survivors. And that matters." She closed the folder. "That concludes this session." No applause. No victory cheer. But the air in the room loosened, like a collective breath released at once. As they filtered out, Doc clapped Reuben's shoulder. "That went smoother than half our field ops." Ortega ran ahead to reunite with Scout and Dusty. He ruffled Scout's ears. "You're officially a courtroom legend now," he whispered. Back in the storage shed that evening, the desert wind softened to a warm breeze. Sunset painted the hills in molten orange. Loretta curled in her nest of blankets, Scout tucked under her chin, Dusty pressed into her side. Reuben watched them for a long time. His shoulders finally eased. For the first time since he'd arrived at the base, the storm outside was quieter than the peace within. The heat returned 2 days later with a vengeance, blanketing the Mojave like a shimmering curtain. Dust devils twisted across the open flats, rising and collapsing in lazy spirals. But inside the base, the air felt strangely still, heavy with expectation, and with the quiet weight of whatever came next. Reuben Walsh stood outside the storage shed, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the edge of the lot. A white civilian SUV rumbled through the gate, kicking up a cloud of pale dust. Stenciled on the side were the words: California State Veterinary Outreach Unit. Behind the wheel sat a lean woman in her 60s with sharp cheekbones, gray hair cut to her jawline, and tortoiseshell glasses perched halfway down her nose. She wore a denim button-up, sleeves rolled to the elbow, revealing a faded paw print tattoo on her forearm. This was Ginny Poe, retired veterinarian, field investigator, and local legend for having zero tolerance for cruelty and even less for bureaucratic nonsense. Doc Ashford had called her personally. Ginny stepped out, grabbing a canvas bag and clipboard. Her boots crunched on the gravel as she approached Reuben. "You're the one with the shepherd and her babies?" she asked without any greeting. "Loretta and her pups," Reuben confirmed. "Show me." Inside the shed, Ginny moved with a calm that came from decades of patching up animals harmed by people who didn't deserve them. Loretta watched her cautiously, muscles tight but not aggressive. She didn't growl, just stared, bracing. Ginny crouched, running gentle fingers along Loretta's foreleg. "She's healing," Ginny murmured. "Scar tissue forming. That burn on her neck is recent, but not the first she's had." She tapped the skin lightly. "This girl's been bred before. Multiple litters. I'd put her around 5 or 6. Classic dumping case." She turned to the pups. Dusty wobbled toward her, Scout peeking from behind Loretta's belly. Ginny lifted each one, examining their limbs, checking gums, heartbeat, temperature. "They're stronger than I expected," she said. "But somebody neglected them for a while." "That part we figured," Reuben said. He handed her Ortega's compiled packet, the photo of the dog tag, the registry record, the name J. Dawson, and the notebook the boy had drawn in. "I traced the microchip," Reuben said. "Registered in Fresno. Still active. The owner received state aid for 3 dogs." Ginny lifted an eyebrow. "And yet those dogs are sitting in your shed instead of her yard." She clicked her pen and filled in the first line of a cruelty report. "I can file a preliminary case," she said. "But you'll need a social worker to move this up the chain." Reuben nodded without hesitation. "Do it." The next morning, a dark green state vehicle rolled through the gate. Reuben, Ortega, and Doc waited in the shade as the passenger door opened. Out stepped Danielle Ramos, a California Child and Animal Welfare Services field agent in her early 40s. She carried herself with practiced neutrality, tall, composed, her blazer sharp against the desert sun. Her brown eyes were observant, not cold. She shook hands with each of them. "Let's keep this simple," she said. "I want to observe the dog's condition and hear what you've witnessed." Inside the shed, Danielle knelt beside Loretta the same way Ginny had, letting the dog sniff her hand before making any move. Loretta's ears drooped slightly. Scout hid beneath her belly. Dusty pressed into her side. "She's alert," Danielle noted, "and protective. But she's afraid. That's more than a stray's behavior." "She used to flinch at loud voices," Ortega said. "Not even yelling, just anything sharp." Reuben handed Danielle a small portable speaker. "You should hear this." Danielle pressed play. A voice recording clicked on, part of Ginny's verification call from the previous day. A woman answered. Tracy Miller. The same Tracy tied to the Dawson alias. Her tone was careless, fragmented, as though answering questions while scrolling her phone. "I don't know," Tracy said. I guess they ran off or something. One of them was sick. They smelled bad. The kids hated it. I left them out near the field. They're animals, they'll figure it out. The moment Tracy's recorded voice played, Loretta whimpered, a soft, broken sound, and curled tighter around the pups. Scout tucked her head beneath her mother, shaking. Danielle immediately stopped the audio. That's enough, she said, voice low with anger carefully hidden beneath professionalism. She rose slowly. I'm initiating an immediate investigation. Fresno authorities will be notified. This is now a criminal case, abandonment, neglect, and fraudulent state aid. Doc exhaled deeply. Will we be kept informed? You'll get updates, Danielle said. But you need to be ready. Ready for what? Reuben asked. Danielle looked at him evenly. If this goes to court, Loretta and the pups become evidence. That means temporary state custody. Reuben's shoulders tensed. And after the case? They go back. If the case closes in the owner's favor, Danielle said carefully, yes. No, Reuben's voice was steady, almost quiet. That's not happening. Danielle studied him for a long moment. Then help me make sure it doesn't. That afternoon, back inside the shed, Reuben sat near Loretta as she curled around her pups. Shadows stretched long across the floor. The desert outside hummed with heat. He leaned close. I'm not letting anyone take you back, he whispered. Not a chance. Dusty let out a tiny bark, high and clumsy. Scout nudged Loretta's chin. And Loretta, with a weariness that had finally found a home to rest in, closed her eyes and breathed into her children's warmth. The Barstow Municipal Courthouse sat like a stubborn, sun-baked relic at the far edge of town. Its adobe walls were cracked from decades of heat, and the faded flag above the steps flapped with half-hearted resolve. The inside smelled of old carpet, paper that had been filed and refiled too many times, and burnt coffee that no one bothered to throw out. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead as soldiers, officials, and a few civilians gathered in a room too cramped for the weight of what would unfold inside it. Reuben Walsh sat near the front. His uniform was pressed, the first time he'd really cared about it in weeks. His boots had been wiped clean. His posture was disciplined, but not rigid. Not ceremonial. Instead, it held a kind of quiet steel. Loretta lay at his feet, her fur brushed, her breathing steady. Dusty sat on her right, Scout on her left, both pups noticeably bigger now, stronger, their once fragile limbs finally beginning to hold them up without trembling. Dusty's leg, bandaged and babbied for days, no longer needed wrapping. He leaned against Reuben's shin, tail thumping weakly. You're tougher than half the guys I've served with, Reuben murmured under his breath, scratching behind the pup's ear. To his left, Miles Ortega fiddled nervously with the knot of a tie he clearly didn't own. Beside him, Doc Ashford sat with arms crossed and an expression that hovered between disapproval and readiness, the look of a man who feared nothing except injustice. Across the aisle, 2 empty chairs waited. Then their occupants arrived. Tracy Miller stepped inside, dressed in an immaculate cream blouse and navy blazer, makeup flawless, hair smoothed back like she was walking into a PTA meeting, not a welfare case. She moved with the slow poise of someone used to sympathy and the benefit of the doubt. Behind her came her husband, Martin Miller, a balding man with a face flushed red, not from the heat, but from the pressure. He kept his eyes down, hands folded awkwardly in his lap. The tension shifted when the judge entered. Honorable Judge Myra Easton, a tall woman in her early 60s with stern posture, gray hair tied in a no-nonsense knot, and the cool, measured expression of someone who had long ago run out of patience for excuses. She glanced over her glasses. This hearing concerns the emergency custody status and welfare of a female German Shepherd referred to as Loretta, along with 2 juvenile pups currently housed at the U.S. Army installation outside Barstow. Her tone made the stakes clear. Staff Sergeant Walsh, you may proceed. Reuben stepped forward, handed a flash drive to the court officer, and stepped back. The projector behind the bench flickered to life. First came the night vision footage, Loretta curled tightly around her pups amid the sandstorm, her ribcage sharp beneath her skin, her head lifting only once toward the camera as the wind ripped at her fur. A voice whispered on the recording. "She's shielding them." People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Then came a daytime clip from the storage shed, Scout nudging Dusty's healed leg, Loretta licking their ears as they whimpered softly. Reuben spoke with a rough steadiness. "She never barked. Not once. Not out of pain. Not out of fear. She just protected them." The judge nodded silently. "Thank you, Sergeant Walsh." "Private Ortega." Miles stood, wiping his palms silently on his pants before walking forward. His voice trembled at first, but steadied the longer he talked. "I've been helping with the pups," he said. Dusty used to drag himself across the floor just to curl into his mom's leg. Scout wouldn't sleep unless she could feel her breathing. That's not abandonment behavior. That's love. When Miles sat down, several people looked at Loretta differently, no longer as evidence, but as someone. Then Tracy Miller rose. "Your Honor, I would like to speak." Judge Easton motioned for her to proceed. Tracy stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had lied enough times to believe her own words. "I never abandoned those dogs," she insisted. "I left them somewhere safe. With food. With shade. We had a family emergency. My stepdaughter's allergies were getting worse. The dogs smelled. It wasn't a good environment for them." The judge raised an eyebrow. "You tethered them outside in a wind corridor." "I didn't know a storm was coming." At that exact moment, from the corner of the room where they lay, Scout suddenly stood up and barked once, a loud, sharp sound that echoed through the small courtroom like a gavel strike. Everyone paused. Even the judge looked mildly startled before her expression softened. "It appears someone objects," she said dryly. A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the room. Reuben reached down, gently brushing Scout's head. "Good girl," he whispered. Judge Easton raised her voice slightly. "I have reviewed the documentation, veterinary reports, and witness statements. I find sufficient evidence that Loretta and her pups were abandoned and exposed to unsafe conditions." She looked directly at Tracy. "And based on the emotional bond observed between the animals and their current caregivers, and the evidence presented, I am granting temporary legal custody of all 3 dogs to Staff Sergeant Reuben Walsh." Tracy's expression collapsed into outrage. "What? They're just dogs." Judge Easton's voice sharpened. "No. They are living beings that survived cruelty. And that is not just anything." The gavel struck. Case adjourned. As the room emptied, Doc slapped Reuben lightly on the back. "Hell," he said, "that went smoother than half our missions." Ortega knelt beside Scout, who wagged her tail proudly. "You're officially a courtroom champion," he whispered. Back at the shed that evening, the desert sky blazed orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. Loretta lay curled in her usual corner. Scout snuggled into her chest. Dusty rested his small chin across her back leg. Reuben watched them quietly, breath finally slowing. For the first time in weeks, he felt something like peace, something like healing. And outside, for once, the Mojave wind was silent. The morning sun over the Mojave was never gentle. It rose fast, climbing the sky with a fierce heat that turned the sand gold long before breakfast sounded in the mess hall. But today, instead of carrying grit and silence, the wind carried something different. The clatter of hammers. Pockets of laughter. An old song drifting out of a half-busted field radio. It was a new mission, one without rifles, formations, or orders shouted across hot pavement. This mission had a name now. Max's Shelter. The idea had come from Doc Ashford, naturally. He had stood beneath the warped tin awning of an abandoned watch station, its roof peeling like old sunburn, and murmured to himself. Max would have stayed. Hell, he'd have rebuilt the whole damn place. Max wasn't a man. He was a dog. A war dog Ruben and Doc had served with years ago in Syria. Max had scars over one ear, paws worn from rubble and wire, and a heart too big for any desert. He once dragged a wounded soldier more than 50 yards through gunfire, then barked a warning at an incoming convoy just long enough for everyone to take cover. He died in Ruben's arms, steady, fearless, and loyal until his last breath. When Doc suggested naming the shelter after him, Ruben didn't speak. He just nodded once, quietly, and went to haul lumber. The old station wasn't much, but the soldiers made it work. They salvaged whatever hadn't rotted in the depot: crates, torn tarps, abandoned fence posts, a generator coated in 10 years of dust. Ortega rewired the lights, coaxing the old circuits back to life like a stubborn mule. He even painted the walls in the same weathered olive shade as their uniforms. Others joined the effort without being asked. Corporal Devon Price, tall, lean, with a permanent desert squint, volunteered to build outdoor kennels. Specialist Amanda "Mandy" Ruiz, left arm in a sling from a training accident, brought in blankets she had hand-sewn from scrapped fabric. Someone else donated bags of dog food. Another brought stainless steel bowls from an abandoned convoy crate. Loretta moved slowly but steadily along the edge of the yard, sniffing every plank, every screw, every bag of supplies. Her limp had faded to a mild sway, more confidence than pain. She nudged Dusty and Scout whenever they wandered too far, keeping them within her invisible perimeter. Every so often she would sit beside the gate, watching the desert the way an old soul watches the horizon, quiet, steady, knowing something the rest of them didn't. Ruben was tightening a bolt on a kennel frame when he saw a dust cloud approaching from the north. A red pickup truck rolled into view. Inside were Mrs. Beatrice Henderson, an elderly ranch widow with a spine made of grit and Sunday bread, and her granddaughter, Lily. Lily was around 7. Maybe 8. Her hair shone like desert copper, braided into 2 messy plaits. Her shoes didn't match. Her dress was too big. But she carried herself with a stillness that felt different from other children, a quiet curiosity, steady as stone. Beatrice stepped out first. "Heard rumors," she said in a dry voice. "Dogs. Soldiers. Something good happening out here." She gestured to Lily. "Thought we'd see." Lily climbed down from the passenger seat. Scout spotted her first. The pup bolted toward the girl, ears high, tail whipping like a flag. Lily froze for half a second, uncertain, but Scout skidded to a halt just in front of her, tail wagging in wide, excited arcs. Dusty followed, slower, more cautious, but eager. Lily crouched. The pups walked straight into her lap, pressing their faces into her dress, their small bodies folding into her like they'd been waiting for her their whole lives. Beatrice watched with a slow nod. "They know," she said with a rough chuckle. "Dogs always know which souls are worth waiting on." Ruben approached quietly, wiping sweat from his temple. "You two are welcome anytime," he said. Beatrice tipped her head toward Lily. "She's got a way with things that don't talk. People still confuse her, but critters always understood." Doc was at the front gate, carving letters into a thick wooden plank with his pocketknife. He worked slowly, carefully, each stroke deliberate. When he finished, he stood up and waved Ruben over. Together, they lifted the sign. They nailed it above the entrance gate, directly over the sandbags that now held small flower beds filled with desert marigolds and a stubborn prickly cactus Scout had already tried to eat twice. The sign read, "Max's Shelter. Here, every soul is found before it's too late." When the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of fire, the small team gathered outside. Some leaned on shovels. Some sat cross-legged on the ground with dogs sprawled beside them. The generator hummed softly beneath the radio's scratchy jazz. Loretta lay beneath the porch light, head resting gently on Scout's back. Dusty curled into her stomach, tail twitching in tiny dreams. Miles leaned against the wall beside Reuben, both men watching the sky shift from gold to purple. "Think we'll keep this going?" Doc asked from his crate seat, puffing softly on a small cigar. Reuben didn't look away from the horizon. "We don't have a choice," he said. Doc nodded. "Some things don't just need rescuing. They need saving." Behind them, Lily whispered secrets into Dusty's ear. Dusty yawned like he'd known her forever. And in the quiet moment that followed, the truth settled like a blessing over all of them. In a world filled with brokenness and forgotten souls, love had carved out a sanctuary in the middle of the desert. Not because someone ordered it. Not because it was duty. But because compassion had found a place to bloom, even in the harshest sand. The days that followed felt different. Not easier, life on base never truly became easy, but there was a new steadiness in the air, a kind of quiet purpose humming through the soldiers who chose to spend their free hours at Max's shelter. Some soldiers came because they loved dogs. Others came because the desert felt less lonely with warm fur pressed against their boots. And a few came because, for the first time in months, helping something helpless made them feel human again. Reuben noticed it in the shift of footsteps outside the shed. In the soft laughter from the yard. In the way Scout now trotted instead of limping, her tail in a confident arc. Dusty, once the scared, trembling pup who clung to Loretta like an extra limb, had begun bounding, still wobbly, still imperfect, but with a courage he'd never shown before. And Loretta. Loretta had begun to trust. Not fully, not completely, but the haunted tension in her chest had eased. She walked with her head higher. Her steps slower, more thoughtful. Whenever Reuben approached, she leaned her weight slightly into him, just enough to say, "I still remember everything. But I'm choosing to stay." One morning, when the sky was hazy with dust, Reuben was repairing an outdoor water tank behind the shelter. His shirt clung to his back in the heat. Sweat dripped down his temples. But he kept working, tightening each bolt with quiet determination. He didn't realize he'd been watched. Loretta padded across the sand, settling beside him. She sat upright, patient, regal in the way only shepherds could be, ears alert, eyes warm. "You're supervising me now?" he asked, forcing a crooked smile. She responded by nudging his elbow with her nose. Firm. Decisive. Almost bossy. Reuben exhaled softly. "I know," he murmured. "We're going to get through all this." Later that afternoon, a convoy truck eased through the gate, carrying tarps, storage bins, and 3 large bags of donated dog chow. The driver waved as he unloaded. Corporal Price and Mandy Ruiz organized everything, labeling crates and sorting supplies like seasoned quartermasters. In the middle of the bustle, Lily returned. She hopped out of her grandmother's truck before it fully stopped, legs pumping like she'd spent the entire ride vibrating with excitement. Scout and Dusty sprinted toward her, 2 streaks of tan fur, colliding against her shins with joyous yelps. Lily fell backward into the sand, laughing as the pups clambered over her in a chaotic, loving pile. Beatrice took a seat on a nearby crate. "Told you she'd be back," she said, scratching the pup who insisted on climbing into her lap despite being much too large already. But something different happened today. When Lily sat up, Dusty, usually glued to Loretta when nervous, didn't run back. He stayed with her. Scout too, tail swishing like a little flag. Loretta stood only 10 feet away, watching carefully. Her posture was alert but not alarmed, just observant. Accepting. "Look at that," Doc murmured to Reuben from across the yard. "She's letting go a little." "Not letting go," Reuben corrected quietly. "Just letting them grow." The moment didn't last long. A sudden heavy engine rumbled at the entrance. A boxy state-issued SUV pulled into the lot, its tires grinding against gravel with an authority that made the yard fall silent. Danielle Ramos stepped out. Her blazer was folded over her arm this time, more casual, more personal. But the seriousness in her expression hadn't changed. "Walsh," she called. Reuben met her halfway across the lot. "Tell me this isn't bad news." Danielle shook her head. "Not bad. But serious." Behind her, another figure emerged from the car. A teenage boy, maybe 14. Thin. Shoulders slumped like he carried a weight no one his age should understand. His clothes were clean but worn. His dark hair fell over his eyes, which stayed fixed on the ground. "This is Ethan Dawson," Danielle said. The name hit like a sandstorm. Reuben's chest tightened. Dawson. The registered owner. The address linked to Loretta. But the boy didn't look like a perpetrator. He looked like someone who had been lost for a long time. Danielle spoke softly. "He asked to come. He said he needed to see her." Reuben remained silent, processing, gauging. The boy lifted his head, revealing eyes swollen from crying. "Is she here?" he whispered. Reuben didn't answer with words. He stepped aside. Loretta had already seen him. She walked to the edge of the yard, slow, uncertain. Her steps faltered once. Twice. She stopped 5 feet from the boy, head tilted, ears rising ever so slightly. Ethan dropped to his knees. "I'm sorry," he choked. "I didn't leave you. I swear I didn't. I tried to take you with me but, she wouldn't let me." His voice broke apart. Loretta approached him cautiously, tail low, body tense. Then Ethan reached into his pocket. He pulled out something small, wrapped in faded blue cloth. A matching dog tag. The twin to hers. He held it in both hands like an apology made of metal and memory. "I made them for you," he whispered. "You weren't a mistake. You never were." Loretta's body trembled. Not with fear. With recognition. She pressed her forehead gently into the boy's chest, letting out a soft whine, one filled with old hurt and a sudden flood of relief. Ethan cried into her fur. Miles Ortega stood frozen beside Mandy. Doc closed his eyes. Reuben felt something heavy shift in his chest. After several long moments, Ethan wiped his face, still kneeling. "I don't want to take her away," he said, looking at Reuben. "I just wanted her to know I didn't abandon her." Reuben crouched beside him. "She knows now," he said quietly. "And she forgives you." Ethan nodded, trembling. Danielle rested a hand on his shoulder. "You ready to head back?" He hesitated, petting Loretta one last time. Can I see her again?" Reuben answered gently, "Anytime you want." Ethan managed a weak smile before standing, giving Loretta one final look, and climbing into the SUV. The car rolled away, kicking up dust. Loretta watched it disappear, ears lifted, tail still, eyes softened by something deeper than memory. Not sadness. Not longing. Closure. The kind no courtroom could give her. The kind she needed to move forward. The next morning felt unusually calm. The sky was pale, washed in soft blues and yellows instead of the harsh, blistering heat the desert usually hurled at dawn. A cool breeze drifted across Max's shelter, carrying the faint scent of brush and early sunlight. It was a rare kind of quiet, the kind that didn't feel empty, but full. Full of healing. Full of peace. Full of the sense that things left broken in the world sometimes found ways to mend themselves. Reuben stood on the porch with a mug of steaming coffee, watching Dusty and Scout chase each other around an old tire repurposed as a play ring. Dusty was faster now, still a bit uneven in his gait, but determined. Scout was quicker on turns, darting to nip at her brother's heels with gleeful mischief. Loretta rested nearby on a sand-worn blanket, eyes half-lidded, body loose with the ease of someone who finally trusted her surroundings. She wasn't guarding anymore. She was simply watching. A mother no longer afraid the world would try to take something from her. Doc Ashford stepped beside Reuben, arms folded across his chest, expression contemplative. "Never thought I'd see this," he murmured. "A dog who's been through what she has, relaxing in the middle of the Mojave." "She deserves it," Reuben said. Doc grunted. "They all do." Before Reuben could reply, a familiar voice floated across the yard. "Morning." Lily came hopping through the front gate, carrying a backpack nearly half her size. Beatrice followed with the steady steps of someone built from desert stone. Scout immediately barreled toward Lily, leaping into her arms. Dusty followed, his tail thumping like a drum. Lily's laughter spilled across the yard like sunshine. "I brought them something," she announced proudly. She unzipped the backpack and pulled out 2 worn tennis balls and a thin rope toy tied into knots. Scout seized the rope immediately, whipping her head around like she'd won a prize. Dusty pounced on one of the tennis balls, rolling across the sand with a grunt. Loretta approached too, sniffing the toys before nudging Lily gently in greeting. Lily scratched behind her ears, whispering soft little words only the dog seemed to understand. Reuben smiled at the scene, and that's when he heard the rumble of another engine. A tan government van approached slowly, dust swirling behind its tires. Danielle Ramos stepped out, clipboard tucked beneath her arm. She looked more rested than the last time Reuben had seen her, as though the weight she carried had lightened. "Walsh," she greeted. "Danielle." She didn't waste time. "I have updates from Fresno." Reuben stiffened slightly. Doc moved closer. Lily paused her play. Even Loretta lifted her head. Danielle opened her folder. "The investigation is officially closed. Tracy Miller has been charged. Fraud, neglect, abandonment. She won't be getting custody of any animals again, not legally, not in this lifetime." Reuben exhaled sharply, tension draining from his shoulders. "And the boy?" he asked quietly. "Ethan is placed with extended family. Stable home. He'll be okay." Reuben nodded. "Good." Danielle flipped to another page, this one marked with a large official stamp. "As for Loretta, Scout, and Dusty." Reuben braced. "State custody is being transferred," Danielle continued, a slow smile forming. "To you." Reuben blinked. "To me?" "Yes. Full legal ownership. Permanent." Miles Ortega, who had just arrived carrying a pail of kibble, nearly dropped it. Doc muttered, "About damn time." Beatrice clapped her hands once in satisfaction. Lily squealed. Reuben didn't react at first. He simply looked at Loretta, really looked. At the dog who had survived storms and cruelty and abandonment. Who had fought to protect her pups in a nightmare no one should endure. Who had trusted him of all people to keep her safe. Loretta walked toward him with calm certainty, tail swaying gently. She pressed her head into his thigh. A simple gesture. A decisive one. As if she had known the decision long before he did. Reuben placed a hand on her neck. "You're home now," he murmured. Dusty yapped. Scout bounced. The entire yard seemed to brighten. Danielle closed her folder. "There's one more thing," she said. Everyone looked at her. "This shelter. Max's shelter, if you want to register it officially as a rescue center, the state is willing to help provide partial funding. You've already met half the criteria. The rest is paperwork and inspections." Reuben froze. He hadn't expected that. Doc chuckled under his breath. "Looks like you're a director now." Reuben ran a hand over his face, overwhelmed but not in a bad way. "I didn't build this for recognition," he said softly. Danielle nodded. "But you built something that's saving lives. And we notice that sort of thing. Reuben looked around him. The makeshift kennels. The small garden of desert marigolds. Miles trying to convince Scout not to steal his boot. Lily braiding a piece of rope for Dusty. Loretta resting her head against him like she finally understood the meaning of peace. He'd never asked for a purpose outside the military. But maybe purpose had found him anyway. Yeah, he said quietly. Let's make it official. Danielle smiled, shook his hand, and headed back to the van. As the dust settled behind her, Doc nudged Reuben with his elbow. Think Max would be proud? Reuben watched Loretta roll onto her side as Scout climbed over her and Dusty began chewing the new rope toy like a tiny warrior. Yeah, Reuben said, voice warm. I think he'd want us to keep going. The sun rose higher, casting long golden rays across the shelter. The wind hummed gently, not harsh or angry, just present, as if acknowledging the new life carved into this harsh expanse. In the middle of the Mojave, in a yard built from scraps and compassion, something powerful had taken root. Not just a shelter. Not just a mission. But a promise. A promise that no soul, four-legged or two, would be left to suffer alone again. Reuben placed a hand over Loretta's back. You're home, he whispered once more. And this time, she believed him. Weeks passed, and Max's shelter found its rhythm. Not a perfect rhythm, nothing in the Mojave ever worked perfectly, but a steady one. The kind born from effort, patience, and the simple truth that healing rarely happens in straight lines. The once empty yard now bustled with life. Soldiers drifted in during lunch breaks or after shifts, leaning against fences as they tossed balls, cleaned water troughs, or let pups crawl into their laps for warmth. The place had become a refuge not just for the dogs, but for everyone who stepped across its threshold. Reuben didn't call it therapy. Neither did Doc. But they all felt it. The shelter was changing them. And they were changing the shelter. One afternoon, a call came from a truck driver who had spotted a limping stray near the highway. Another message came from a family moving out of state who couldn't bring their aging cattle dog. A third came from a rancher whose shepherd mix had pups during a bad storm. The shelter grew, quietly, steadily. Corporal Price expanded the kennels, adding shaded runs and raised beds made from old pallets. Mandy Ruiz, now healed from her injury, painted the interior walls in soft desert hues, sage green, dusty mahogany, and warm cream. Ortega installed motion sensor lights to keep coyotes away during night hours. Max's shelter was no longer a patchwork project. It was a sanctuary. A real one. And Loretta seemed to understand that. She greeted new dogs with soft, cautious sniffs. She supervised Dusty and Scout with a patience only a mother who'd nearly lost everything could know. She even learned to sit beside visitors, watching their expressions as if deciding who needed comfort the most. Some people came stiff, unsure, weighed down. They left smiling. Loretta did that. Scout and Dusty too. Animals have a way of reaching places language can't. One morning, just as the sun began to glow across the horizon, a small package arrived at the shelter gates. No return address. Just a simple envelope tied with twine. Reuben opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph. A younger Ethan Dawson, no older than 10, grinning as Loretta stood beside him, her fur vibrant and glossy, her body full of youthful strength. The boy had his arm around her neck, face pressed into her fur. On the back, in shaky handwriting, were the words. I'll visit soon. Thank you for saving her. Ethan. Reuben swallowed hard. He handed the photo to Doc. Kid's got heart, Doc said softly. Reuben pinned the photo inside the main office trailer, right above Max's old military collar, which hung from a rusted nail in a place of honor. By late afternoon, Dusty surprised everyone. He sprinted. Not the wobbly, half-hop he'd done for weeks. Not the cautious jog. A full, powerful run, ears flapping, tail straight, paws kicking up tiny clouds of sand behind him as he tore across the yard after Scout. He barreled straight toward Reuben, who barely had time to kneel. Dusty leapt into his arms, licking his face wildly. Reuben laughed, really laughed, the sound deep and unguarded. "You little miracle," he whispered into the pup's neck. Doc leaned on the fence, smiling proudly. Guess his leg decided today was the day. Scout bounded around them in excited circles. Loretta approached with her calm dignity, touching her nose to Dusty's forehead. Pride radiated off her like heat off the sand. This was the moment she had fought for in that storm. Her pups alive, strong, running freely. That evening, Reuben lit the single lantern outside the shelter, a soft, golden glow that illuminated the sand and wooden signs and the silhouettes of soldiers drifting through the yard. He stood beneath the quiet sky, breaths long and steady, watching Scout tug at a rope with Lily while Dusty chased a straw broom Ortega kept pretending to sweep with. Doc stepped up beside him. "You ever think about what'll happen when deployment orders come?" Doc asked quietly. Reuben's jaw tightened. "Don't remind me." "You know they'll come eventually," Doc said. "They always do." Reuben nodded slowly. "Then I make a plan," he said. "A good one. A strong one. One that keeps them safe even if I'm not here." Doc studied him for a moment. "You think you'll ever leave them behind?" Reuben shook his head. "Not in this lifetime." The night deepened. Stars began to prick through the sky. The shelter hummed with soft noises, paws against sand, the squeak of a ball, the murmurs of soldiers lingering outside their bunks. Loretta settled at Reuben's feet, resting her chin across his boot. He placed a hand on her head. "You saved them," he whispered. "But you saved me too." Her eyes closed in quiet understanding. Because somewhere in the chaos of storms and courtrooms and broken hearts, they had all found something they needed. A home. A purpose. A place where loss was met with healing, where fear was met with gentleness, where love wasn't demanded, but given freely. Max's shelter wasn't just a name carved into wood anymore. It was a promise living in every grain of desert sand under their feet. And Reuben intended to keep that promise for as long as breath lived in him.